Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, today our guest is Rob Moore. Rob is the director of the Water and Climate team at the Natural Resources Defense Council. He and his team work mainly on policies related to flood risk, sea level rise, climate adaptation, and disasters. That includes seeking reforms to policies like the Troubled National Flood Insurance Program. Rob will share how the National Flood Insurance Program works and how it needs to be reformed if it's going to help the nation cope with the flood-related impacts of climate change. Furthermore, Rob will explore the feasibility of managed retreat given the tools we have available and draws relevant policy recommendations. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me on.
No, this is a thrill. I was so happy that you got in here and we're going to have this conversation. We've talked before. You're doing some amazing work. Before we dig into that, I just checking in with my guests. So obviously from the looks of what's behind you, you have a new office, but how are you dealing with COVID-19?
Yeah, so I've moved into a secure, undisclosed location for the duration of the pandemic. So I can't tell you exactly where I'm at, Doug, but I can tell you it is a garage outside of my home. So I've been working kind of outside, but not really. But it could definitely be worse. So it's semi-climate controlled, and spring is in the air, summer's on the horizon. So at least I've turned the space heater off out here. I built myself a really nice, do-it-yourself desk. Very proud of that. It's on casters, so I'm technically mobile. So if I wanted to go outside and work in the driveway, I'm only limited by the length of my extension cord now.
I get the vibe of like Doc Brown's place in Back to the Future. So
yeah.
All right, let's jump into this. What do you do at NRDC? We kind of described some of the topics that you cover, but you have a team there. So what are you doing at NRDC?
Yeah, I'm the director of the Water and Climate team, which is among a small group of people at NRDC that are increasingly turning their attentions to issues around climate adaptation, which is becoming a bigger and bigger segment of not only NRDC's portfolio, but I think that's true of a lot of environmental organizations across the board. And our team mostly focuses on kind of the wet end of the spectrum of climate impact. So as you said in your intro, we mostly work on issues related to the increasing incidence of flooding and sea level rise, and in large part looking at the federal policies, but also we're getting more into looking at state and local actions as well that address those issues. And because of the nature of the work we do around flood disasters and sea level rise, we also end up being the team at NRDC with the most experience kind of with disaster policy more generally, and agencies like the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
All right, let's just start it off. Why are flood policies, so insane in this country? And you're having to deal with that on a daily basis, but can you kind of maybe give us that broader context?
Yeah, I think in many ways we're dealing with problems of history. So the National Flood Insurance Program, which is really, in many ways, kind of the baseline federal program that defines our nation's approach, and by extension, state and local community approaches to managing flood risk and dealing with the aftermath of flood disasters and incidents of flood damage. And when that program was created in the late 60s, early 1970s, it was created because private insurers just wanted nothing to do with underwriting flood risk anymore. They were losing money, they were paying out more in claims than they were collecting in premiums. So the federal government stepped in, and we essentially created what I sometimes joke was Obamacare for flooding. back in the 1970s, where we essentially socialized the risk of flood disasters. And the program actually worked fairly well. Despite its name, the National Flood Insurance Program is actually much more than an insurance program. So its primary function, as the name says very clearly, is to sell insurance. But it also does, two other things that are critically important. The first of those is it is responsible for mapping areas of high flood risk in the United States so that communities know where they should and shouldn't build in theory. And then the third thing it does is it sets some minimum codes and standards that all 22,000 participating communities in the US must adopt. So that helps define some minimum building codes and some minimum zoning ordinances that are in theory supposed to guide development out of floodplains and set some standards for making more flood resilient development when it does recur. In practice, none of those things have really played out as intended. And I think starting with Hurricane Katrina, the program has gotten into real dire financial straits. As private insurers experienced in the 60s and 70s, the program pays out way more in damage claims than it collects in premiums. But this isn't just a problem of fiscal accounting. I think a lot of people look at the troubles of the National Flood Insurance Program simply as a dollars and cents issue. The real trouble is that the way the program works, we're increasingly putting people in harm's way. We're not giving them adequate information that would allow them to make better decisions to stay out of harm's way. And the program is set up to basically keep paying people to rebuild and stay in harm's way. And until we change all of those things, we basically have a program that is ill-suited to addressing the challenges that we are now facing because of climate change and the resulting elevated risks of flooding.
So this idea of rebuilding homes that have been flooded, I forgot if you had that statistic. I think I heard one home had been rebuilt 12 times or 20 times. It was some ridiculous number. I mean, what are some of the examples in that regards of homes that not just once or twice, but many, many times over?
Yeah, there's in the parlance of FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program, there's a list of about over 36,000 properties that FEMA classifies as severe repetitive loss properties. So those are essentially the most flood-prone homes in the United States that are covered by the National Flood Insurance Program. And there's, there are examples in that body of properties that have flooded 30, 35, 40 times, or at least they filed that many damage claims of the National Flood Insurance Program. And we've paid out, in some cases, many times over what the property's even worth. I will say those types of extreme examples are outliers. If you look across all of those 36,000 properties, on average, those properties have flooded about 5 times each. And they flood about every, it's not a long time in between floods. It can be as frequently as every couple of years, and sometimes every 3 to 4 years. So those things are all symptomatic of the various problems of the flood insurance program. We're not successfully keeping people from moving into harm's way. Our flood maps don't reflect, in many instances, the true risks of flooding in an area. And all of our building codes and zoning codes are predicated on that inadequate information. So, yeah, we have a program that should really be a linchpin in our response to adapting to these impacts that climate change is forcing upon us. But in reality, in its current form, the National Flood Insurance Program is something of a liability in addressing those challenges.
Okay, so you've talked about mapping, and so this in itself needs all sorts of reforms. With the terminology of a 1 in a 500-year flood event, 1 in a 100-year flood event, climate change is just turning that on its head. I think and I want to ask you later about it, but Ellicott City in Maryland, I think they had a 1 in a 500 year flood event like twice in 4 years, something like that. And how is that holding reform back when using mapping terminology like that is just completely pointless these days?
Yeah, I think that the terminology is troublesome for sure. It gives people a sense that, oh, well, we had that big flood, so now we're good for a couple of centuries,
Right.
which is far from the case. And Ellicott City is hardly the only example of that. When Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, Texas in 2017, that was actually the third 500-year flood in 3 years for that area. And then, last year they had another huge tropical storm that brought pretty severe flooding to that region again. So this is becoming, in many parts of the country, an all too regular exercise of setting new flood records. So part of the problem of how we come to call a flood a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood is how FEMA goes about making that determination in the first place. So when we make flood maps in this country, they're based exclusively on historical experience. So the assumption that's implicit in that approach is that the future looks like the past. And if there's one thing we know about climate change, it's that the future looks anything like the past. I've heard it just a great analogy for thinking about this is it's as if we were navigating down a road in a car using nothing but our rear view mirror. That approach works really, really well, or at least adequately, on a straight road. But you're going to miss the first turn that's ahead of you and the first tree that's behind that turn. And we just continue to make that mistake over and over again. FEMA's flood maps only look backwards in time. So in some ways, they're out of date on the day they're published. They tell you what the flood risk was and what you can reasonably expect it to be based solely on past experience. There is nothing in those flood maps that considers what we know about future sea level rise, increased incidence of extreme precipitation. And there's even certain types of flooding that also aren't captured on those maps. So they really only account for flooding like a river coming out of its banks because of a big storm or a hurricane coming ashore and pushing storm surge in. They don't account for things like urban flooding. So we end up probably undercounting the number of properties that are truly at high risk of flooding. And residents who live in those areas know this all too well.
So behind a lot of these decisions are the politics, and these people are able to rebuild because there's political, I guess, power allowing them to do that, and we're not getting the reform of the flood insurance. But why is that? There's actually probably not a lot of people. I mean, if you look at population wise, and the fact that it's costing so much, it seems like a no-brainer that politicians would be like, we're just dumping money in here. Why is it so hard to reform?
Yeah, it's that's an excellent question, and the answer to that question, somewhat frustratingly and somewhat refreshingly, isn't related to the politics of Washington D.C., which we've come to accept as the norm, right? It doesn't fall along the traditional partisan divide, where it's because Republicans won't do this or Democrats won't do that. Actually, this is an area where there's a huge amount of bipartisan agreement about what the problems are and what the solutions are. Unfortunately, there's also a huge amount of bipartisan opposition to implementing those solutions, and a lot of it gets driven by some of the some of these issues that are just hard to get people to let go of, right? So communities think that their future is predicated on development, and development is often needs to take place near water. So if you do anything that might make development in those areas look less appealing, that's bad for property taxes. So therefore, we shouldn't reform flood insurance. So we end up tripping over a lot of considerations that probably don't really hold water with closer scrutiny, and unfortunately, we just keep perpetuating the problems. But in general, there's pretty widespread acknowledgement that what we're doing isn't working in any sense. It's bad fiscal policy. It's bad policy for the people being affected by these incidents. And the only ones that it probably is benefiting are the people who make money putting these homes in harm's way in the first place.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about managed retreat. And, I think up till now, a lot of that is associated with coastal areas. And so, you have flooding in coastal areas, but you could argue that managed retreat also applies to, flooding on rivering systems. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about here. And I'm wondering if there's any lessons to be learned, because you think about if an area, someone builds a home in a floodplain, it floods, but then water goes down and they go back and they rebuild. And it's not going to flood again for another 50 years, but it does. Whereas with managed retreat and coastal systems, if you look at sea level rise, there's a sort of concession that, well, sea level rise, it's going to come up and flood and it's not going to go back down. And it's a much slower moving creature. But I'm just curious, from the work that you do, are you guys learning any lessons? You're keeping your finger, I'm sure, on what's happening with managed retreat research and such. Are there lessons to be learned on how people are approaching adaptation in coastal systems to what might apply to rivering systems? Or maybe you don't know the answer.
I think to a certain degree, there's information and lessons learned flowing in both directions. I think the challenge we have with managed retreat, regardless of whether it's coastal or along inland waterways, is nobody's really tackling the full scope of the problem of what's entailed with something as complex as managed retreat. Often when we talk about managed retreat, the emphasis is placed on how are we going to give people the resources to be able to leave and go somewhere else. And full disclosure, I'm as guilty of that as anybody. A lot of the work that my team does is focused around how do we more equitably make things like publicly financed buyouts of flood-prone homes more widely accessible and easier for people to get. But what we really need to be thinking about, if you're truly going to do something along the lines of what we think in the theoretical as managed retreat, is you've got to think about not only where are people leaving, but where are they going? What's the destination they want to achieve, they want to get to, and where should the community want them to get to? So then the community is also thinking about, okay, what infrastructure assets do we need to also consider relocating or retrofitting in order to keep functioning for their entire design life? Where do we want our economic development to occur? Where do we want people who are going to work in businesses in our community? Where are they going to live? Are they going to have an ability to get to work on a regular basis? So there's a whole lot of things that need to be wrapped into a real discussion about managed retreat. I'd say what we're really doing now is, at best, we have kind of an ad hoc approach to buying out tens of properties here, tens of properties there, by and large. And even there, we're not learning the lessons. We're not learning lessons fast enough to even provide that small amount of assistance in a way that's predictable for the participants, that reaches everybody that needs that assistance, and do it in a way that's timely, so that people don't give up hope.
NRDC is a big organization. As you just described managed retreat, it's going to require thinking about where these people are going. And so your shop, obviously not a huge shop, but with other people at NRDC looking at urban planning, and are you having these conversations? Because it seems like there's this managed retreat would cover a lot of different spaces within NRDC and what they do, and they might not even realize it yet. Are you having those conversations?
Yeah, I think those are things that are starting to happen, both within NRDC and from what I can tell from other organizations like ours as well, and a wide array of organizations that that don't fall into the environmental green space, for instance. I think as people realize just how fast the climate is changing and just how daunting of a challenge it is to reduce emissions to the point where we'll hold warming to hopefully 2 degrees Celsius. You look out the window, you look at the newspaper. The world's very different right now, having just warmed a little over 1 degree Celsius. So even if we achieve 2 degrees Celsius, that cap, things definitely don't look better than they do now. So I think as people understand and come to appreciate that, wow, we've got our work cut out for us in the climate adaptation arena, regardless of how successful our emissions reductions efforts are going to be. So I guess the short answer was yes. The long answer is also yes, but yeah, we're definitely having those conversations with a wider swath of our colleagues at NRDC these days, which is really great to see.
Okay, so flood insurance reform and managed retreat. So do you have a list of top priorities, or maybe you could give us a preview of what are some policy changes you'd like to see in the next 6 months, next year? Like what's really keeping you busy and what would be considered victories?
Yeah, so a handful of things just specific to flood insurance I'd start out with. So Congress has been nearly 3 years delinquent on delivering a flood insurance reform package. It was supposed to get that done in 2017. It's passed. I have now lost count of how many short-term extensions it's done, but it's in the mid to high teens, I believe, at this point. But the reforms that NRDC is specifically seeking is one, there needs to be a federal requirement that states have a real estate disclosure act that ensures that buyers and renters of real estate know what the property's flood history is when they buy it. It's kind of shocking, but about 30 states in the U.S. have what NRDC would judge to be either no disclosure law or a completely inadequate disclosure law. So that if you are buying a home or renting a home, you will never be told that place has flooded 3 times in the last 5 years or twice in the last 10 years. You'll have absolutely no knowledge of that, and that's completely unacceptable. And that's something Congress could change and basically say, look, if you want communities in your state to be able to purchase flood insurance, then the state needs to have a disclosure law that at a minimum gives people that information. So that's a big thing that we're seeking. One of the other areas that we've been pushing for are just these reforms to the mapping program and making sure that FEMA is actually mapping what the future looks like and making sure that those maps apply to local development decisions, so that if we know 3 feet of sea level rise is a real risk over the next 50 years, that's taken into account when we are siting sewage treatment plants or building a housing development, so that those things can be, that we're making fully informed decisions about what the future has in store. And then one of the last things we're working on is this issue of how do you make assistance to relocate more readily available. So we talked about this problem earlier of severe repetitive loss properties. And you asked the very obvious question that anybody would ask. Well, why do we keep paying to rebuild these homes over and over again? A lot of times, the answer to that question is even more frustrating, because the people whose homes are being flooded and who are rebuilding are asking themselves the same question. why is the only assistance that's available to me to rebuild? I don't want to rebuild. I don't want to live in this house anymore. Yet that's the only assistance that's readily available to them through the National Flood Insurance Program. So we've been making some good headway in getting support on both sides of the aisle for actually doing some things inside the National Flood Insurance Program that would make it easier to secure assistance for financing of a purchase of the home. The local government could take ownership of it, and the people would be free to relocate somewhere else.
All right, so I need to wrap this up relatively soon, but I just wanted to do one follow-up question. That the notion of disclosure, obviously very important, having that information. But on the flip side of that, when they bought their home, they potentially didn't have that disclosure. They didn't realize what they're buying into. And so I guess what you just answered in regards to helping people rebuild is that unless you have like a buyout program, if people can't sell their home and they're kind of stuck in a home that's going to flood all the time, it's the ones that flooded 7 or 8 times, you're just like, what, they're on their own. But you know what I'm saying? It's just, how do we encourage people to move out of these areas and so that disclosure law, which I agree with, but if it discourages them from being able to sell their home and move, we want ultimately that house to just not even be there, right? So, I mean, a few things have to kind of be working together.
Yeah, there's definitely an issue of fairness in all of these decisions. So, around disclosure, are you penalizing the person that didn't have the benefit of disclosure and helping the person that's coming after them? Those are really sticky issues for sure. But I think at some point we do just have to recognize that this is information people should have a right to. And that doesn't mean that shouldn't result in somebody being trapped in a home or seeing the devaluation of their home as a result necessarily, particularly for lower income people. So that's something that is something that in our team's work we really try to stay very cognizant of. So when we talk about buyouts, for instance, we're not talking about the federal government providing money so that a wealthy second homeowner with a beachfront cottage gets a buyout. We're talking about people more like the thousands of homes that were flooded, that were lived in by low-income people or people of color, like in Houston, in the Houston area. People that live in historically, perhaps redlined communities where flood risk is a real problem. And they simply don't have the financial ability to wait for 3 years or 4 years or the 5 years it takes to secure a government financed buyout of their home that enables them to move to higher ground. So the way we currently do these buyouts kind of disadvantages the people that need this assistance the most. So how do we help people who are most vulnerable and most in need of assistance get it in a much more timely, predictable, and fair way?
Okay, before we wrap this up, I did get a question from the community room from Ken. Can you name specific elected officials that work on reforming the flood insurance program, or potentially even specific books on the subject?
Sure. And just as a disclaimer, NRDC is, when I say this list, these are not people that this is not be interpreted as a political endorsement or an electoral endorsement. We're not in that game. So, but some of the folks that are really putting a lot of energy into this, Maxine Waters is the chair of the Financial Services Committee in the House. Her office has really been helping lead the way on a lot of these discussions. Before he retired, Representative Sean Duffy, a Republican from Wisconsin, very proactive on these issues, quite helpful in addressing many of these things. I also point to a Democrat in the Houston area. Al Green has been doing phenomenal work on these issues, as has Congressman McHenry, a Republican from the Charlotte, North Carolina area, has been very proactive too. So, as I said earlier, flood insurance is one of these areas where you actually see a lot of bipartisan cooperation on a lot of these issues. So, Maxine Waters' office last year passed a bill for flood insurance reform out of the Financial Services Committee unanimously. Very few things in this political climate get passed unanimously anymore with bipartisan support. But this is an area where that did happen.
All right, so Rob, this has been great. We just scratched the surface on some of these topics that we can talk about, but we need to wrap this up. I want you to hold on. We're going to go into this just chatting section, but again, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Hey, likewise. This is always a lot of fun, and love the new format.
New look, right? All right, so hold on. We'll be right back with you.